I still remember the smell of lavender and old books that filled Grandma's house. That scent hit me the moment I walked through the door for the last time, 3 days after she passed. I stood in the doorway, my hand still on the brass knob she'd polished every Sunday for 40 years, and I couldn't move forward. Behind me, I could hear my mother sniffling into a tissue. Beside her, my father squeezed her shoulder, his own eyes red-rimmed. The funeral was scheduled for the next morning, but Aunt Patricia had insisted we all come to the house that evening. She said it was to reminisce, to share memories before the service. I should have known better. I should have seen what was really happening. But grief makes you stupid sometimes. It makes you want to believe the best in people, even when you know better. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I'm 28 years old. Up until 3 days ago, I was working 60-hour weeks at a marketing firm in downtown Chicago, living in a studio apartment that cost more than my parents' mortgage, and seriously questioning every life choice that had led me there. I hadn't seen Grandma Eleanor in almost 6 months. 6 months. That thought sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy and cold and unforgiving. The last time I'd visited, she'd made her famous ginger cookies, the ones with the crystallized sugar on top that cracked when you bit into them. We'd sat on her back porch, the one that overlooked the garden she'd tended for decades, and she'd held my hand in her papery soft one. Eleanor said, "Rebecca, sweetheart, when did you stop painting? Your mother tells me you haven't picked up a brush in years." I'd pulled my hand away, defensive. I said, "I don't have time for hobbies anymore, Grandma. I have a career, responsibilities." She'd looked at me with those sharp blue eyes of hers, the ones that seemed to see straight through every excuse and rationalization. She said, "A hobby? Is that what we're calling your soul now?" I hadn't known how to respond to that, so I'd changed the subject. We'd talked about her garden instead, about the new rose bushes she'd planted, about the family of cardinals that nested in the oak tree every spring. Safe topics. Easy topics. Topics that didn't require me to examine why I'd stopped doing the one thing that used to make me feel alive. Now she was gone, and I'd never get to have that conversation with her. I'd never get to tell her she was right. The living room was already full when we walked in. Aunt Patricia, my mother's older sister, had somehow arrived before us despite living 2 hours away. She was standing in the center of the room, her phone pressed to her ear, gesturing dramatically at the antique sideboard that had belonged to Grandma's mother. Patricia said into the phone, "Yes, I think it's Victorian. Probably worth quite a bit. I'll have someone come appraise it next week. Oh, and the china cabinet too. Mother always said those pieces were valuable." My mother's face went pale. She whispered, "She's already? She hasn't even been buried yet." My father put his arm around her. He said quietly, "Don't make a scene, Jennifer. Not tonight." But I was already walking toward Patricia, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I said, "Aunt Patricia, what exactly are you doing?" She looked up, her expression shifting from calculating to concerned in an instant. It was impressive, really, how quickly she could rearrange her features. She said, "Oh, Rebecca, honey, I'm just trying to help. Your grandmother had so many things, and your mother is too grief-stricken to handle all this. Someone needs to be practical." Practical. That was Patricia's favorite word. She'd been using it my whole life to justify everything from cheating at family game night to excluding my mother from holiday planning. Being practical, to Patricia, meant making sure she got what she wanted while making it seem like she was doing everyone a favor. Uncle Richard, Patricia's husband, was in the study, literally measuring Grandma's desk with a tape measure. My cousin Marcus, their 25-year-old son, was taking photographs of the bookshelves with his phone. And my other cousin, Diane, Patricia's daughter, was sitting on Grandma's favorite chair, the one with the needlepoint cushion Grandma had made herself, scrolling through her Instagram feed like she was waiting for a dentist appointment. I felt something crack open inside my chest. I said, "This is disgusting. All of you. She's not even in the ground yet." Patricia's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw the cold calculation underneath. She said, "Now, Rebecca, I understand you're upset, but there are practical matters to attend to. Your grandmother's estate needs to be settled. These things have value, and they need to be properly cataloged and distributed according to her wishes." I said, "Her wishes? Since when do you care about what she wished?" My mother appeared at my elbow. She said softly, "Rebecca, please, not now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip over the coffee table and throw everyone out of the house. But Mom looked so tired, so defeated, that I swallowed my anger and nodded. I said, "I need some air." I walked out through the kitchen, past the cookie jar shaped like a fat hen that Grandma had kept filled with butterscotch candies, past the calendar on the wall that still showed last month's date, past the little herb garden on the windowsill that was already starting to wilt from neglect. I stepped out onto the back porch and sucked in a deep breath of cool evening air. The garden was still there, of course. The roses were blooming, pink and yellow and deep red. The cardinals were probably getting ready to settle in for the night. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago. But it wasn't the same. It would never be the same again. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the sky to deepen from blue to purple to almost black. Long enough for the fireflies to come out, little sparks of light drifting through the garden. Long enough for my anger to cool into something harder and more determined. When I came back inside, the house was quieter. Most of the extended family had left, probably to continue their inventory at home, planning their claims on Grandma's possessions. Mom and Dad were in the living room with Patricia and Richard. They all looked up when I entered. Patricia said, "We've been discussing the arrangements for tomorrow. The service is at 10, and then we'll have the gathering here afterward. I've already arranged for catering." Mom said, "Thank you, Patricia. That's very thoughtful." I bit my tongue. Everything Patricia did was strategic, never thoughtful. The funeral the next morning was everything you'd expect and nothing I wanted. The church was full of people I barely recognized, friends of Grandma's from her book club and garden society and Wednesday morning prayer group. They all had stories about her, about how she'd helped them plant their first tomatoes or recommended the perfect novel or brought them soup when they were sick. I sat in the front pew between my parents and listened to strangers talk about my grandmother's generosity, her kindness, her wisdom. All true things. All things I'd taken for granted when she was alive. The pastor, Reverend Mitchell, was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He said, "Eleanor Chen was a woman who believed in leaving the world better than she found it. She believed in nurturing things, helping them grow, whether that was a rose bush or a young person's dreams." I felt Mom squeeze my hand. He continued, "She once told me that the most important thing we can do in this life is to see people for who they really are, not who we want them to be." She had that rare gift of looking at someone and seeing not just their present, but their potential. And then she had the even rarer gift of helping them see it too. After the service, we all drove back to the house in a somber procession. The caterers Patricia had hired were already there, setting up folding tables on the lawn. It felt wrong, turning Grandma's garden into a party venue, but I kept my mouth shut. For Mom's sake, I kept my mouth shut. The gathering was torture. People ate finger sandwiches and made small talk, and occasionally someone would cry, but mostly it felt like any other family party. Except Grandma wasn't there. Except Aunt Patricia kept making pointed comments about how much work there was to do, how many decisions needed to be made, how someone responsible needed to take charge. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the lawyer arrived. I hadn't even known there was going to be a lawyer. Nobody had mentioned it. But suddenly there was this tall, serious-looking woman in a navy suit standing in the doorway, and Patricia was greeting her like she'd been expecting her. Patricia announced, "Everyone, this is Ms. Catherine Walsh, Mother's attorney. She's here to read the will." My mother looked startled. She said, "Patricia, I don't think now is the appropriate time." Patricia said, "The will specifies that it should be read on the day of the funeral, with all family members present. It's what Mother wanted." Ms. Walsh nodded. She said, "If we could all gather in the living room, please. This won't take long." We filed in like school children, finding seats where we could. Patricia positioned herself front and center, Richard beside her. Marcus and Diane flanked them like bodyguards. My parents and I ended up on the couch by the window. Several of Grandma's friends started to leave, but Ms. Walsh stopped them. She said, "Mrs. Chen requested that several friends be present as well. If you're here, it's because she wanted you here." We all exchanged confused glances. What kind of will required an audience? Ms. Walsh opened her briefcase and pulled out several folders. She said, "Eleanor Chen's last will and testament was updated 6 weeks ago. She was of sound mind and body, and I can attest that every word of this document reflects her true wishes." 6 weeks ago. That was just before she went into the hospital the last time. Just before the pneumonia that eventually took her life. Ms. Walsh began reading. Most of it was standard legal language, executors and estates and beneficiaries. Then she got to the specific bequests. She said, "To my daughter Patricia, I leave my pearl necklace, which belonged to my mother, and my collection of first edition mystery novels. I hope you enjoy them as much as I did." Patricia's face went tight. A pearl necklace and some books. That was it? Ms. Walsh continued, "To my son-in-law Richard, I leave my husband's golf clubs and watch collection. May they serve you well." Richard looked pleased until Patricia elbowed him. Ms. Walsh said, "To my grandson Marcus, I leave the sum of $5,000 to be used for education or career development as he sees fit." Marcus perked up. $5,000 wasn't nothing. She said, To my granddaughter Diane, I leave $5,000 as well, with the same stipulations. Diane actually looked up from her phone for once. Then Ms. Walsh said, to my beloved daughter Jennifer, I leave my wedding ring, my collection of family photographs, and the sum of $50,000. Mom gasped. She said softly, oh, Eleanor. I squeezed her hand. $50,000 would change their lives. They could finally pay off the second mortgage they'd taken out when Dad had his heart attack 3 years ago. Patricia's face had gone from tight to furious. She said, what about the house? What about the rest of her assets? Ms. Walsh looked at her over the rim of her glasses. She said, I'm getting to that. To my granddaughter Rebecca Chen, I leave the remainder of my estate, including this house and property, all furnishings and contents therein, my investment portfolio, and all other assets not specifically bequeathed elsewhere. The room went silent. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I said, what? Patricia exploded. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward. She said, this is absurd. This is insane. Rebecca barely visited. She hasn't been here in months. I'm the one who took care of Mother. I'm the one who drove her to doctor's appointments and made sure she had groceries. I'm the one who deserves that house. Ms. Walsh remained calm. She said, Mrs. Patterson, your mother was very clear about her wishes. She left you and your family generous gifts. The remainder goes to Rebecca because she specifically requested it. I couldn't process what I was hearing. The house? Grandma's house? The house I'd grown up visiting every summer, where I'd learned to bake bread and plant seeds and mix paint colors? That house was mine? Patricia said, I'll contest this. I'll take it to court. This is clearly the result of undue influence. Rebecca must have manipulated her. Ms. Walsh said coolly, I anticipated you might feel that way. That's why Mrs. Chen prepared this letter, to be read in the event of any dispute. She pulled out another sheet of paper. She said, these are Eleanor's own words, written in her hand, witnessed and notarized. Would you like me to read it? Patricia sat back down, her jaw clenched. Ms. Walsh read, to my family, I know this distribution may seem unusual to some of you. Patricia, you have always been concerned with practical matters, with the value of things. I appreciate the help you gave me, but I also know that you saw it as an investment. You expected returns. You expected inheritance. Marcus and Diane, you are young and have your lives ahead of you. The money I've left you is to help you start, but not to define you. Jennifer, my darling daughter, you have always been the heart of this family. The ring was your father's choice, and I want you to have it. The money is to ease your burdens, not to create new ones. Ms. Walsh paused, then continued. And Rebecca, my dear, stubborn, talented, lost Rebecca, you stopped painting, sweetheart. You stopped creating. You took a job that pays well but hollows you out from the inside. I've watched you disappear into a life that doesn't fit you, and it breaks my heart. This house, this garden, these things I'm leaving you are not just possessions. They're a chance. A chance to remember who you were before you became who you thought you should be. The house needs someone who will love it, not liquidate it. Someone who will tend the garden, not pave it over for parking. Someone who will fill the rooms with life and color and maybe, just maybe, with art again. I'm giving you permission, Rebecca. Permission to stop. Permission to breathe. Permission to come home to yourself. Don't waste it. And Patricia, before you lawyer up, remember that your mother knew exactly what she was doing. I always do. With all my love, Eleanor. I couldn't breathe. Tears were streaming down my face, and I didn't care who saw. Mom was crying too, her hand gripping mine so tight it hurt. Dad had his arm around both of us. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. She said quietly, this is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But there was nothing she could do. The will was airtight. Ms. Walsh had made sure of that. After everyone left, after the caterers packed up and the last guest said their condolences, after Patricia and her family drove away in furious silence, it was just me and my parents in Grandma's house. My house. I still couldn't wrap my mind around it. Mom said she talked to me about this, a few weeks before she got sick. I looked at her. I said, what did she say? Mom smiled through her tears. She said, she told me she was worried about you. She said you'd lost your way, and she wanted to help you find it again. I told her you were fine, that you had a good job and a nice apartment. But she just shook her head. She said you weren't fine. She said you were drowning and someone needed to throw you a life raft before it was too late. Dad said, your grandmother was a wise woman, stubborn as hell but wise. We sat together in the living room for another hour, just the three of us, sharing memories. Dad told stories about how Grandma used to sneak him extra dessert when Mom wasn't looking. Mom talked about growing up in this house, about how Grandma had always encouraged her to pursue her dreams, even when those dreams seemed impractical. I listened, realizing how much I didn't know about Grandma's life, about the woman she'd been before she became my grandmother. Mom said, "You know, when I was your age, I wanted to be a journalist. I had this whole plan to work for a big newspaper, travel the world, write important stories. But then I met your father, and we got married young, and then you came along, and somehow all those dreams just faded into the background." I'd never heard this before. I said, "Do you regret it?" She thought for a moment. She said, "No, but I do regret not finding a way to hold on to some part of that dream. I let it go completely, told myself it was impractical, that I had responsibilities." Sound familiar? It did sound familiar, painfully so. She continued, "Your grandmother watched me do that, and then she watched you do the same thing. She used to tell me, 'Jennifer, history is repeating itself. Rebecca is making the same mistake you made, choosing security over passion. But unlike me, you still have time to change course.'" Dad added, "She was planning this for months, Becca. The will update, the letter, everything. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. She even consulted with Ms. Walsh about the legal language to make sure Patricia couldn't contest it successfully." I felt tears sliding down my face. I said, "I didn't deserve this. I wasn't there for her. I barely visited." Mom took my hand. She said, "That's exactly why she did it, sweetheart. She wasn't rewarding past behavior. She was investing in your future. She believed in who you could become, not who you'd been." After my parents left, promising to come back the next day to help with whatever I needed, I found myself alone in the house for the first time as its owner. The silence was overwhelming. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the windows, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed amplified. I wandered from room to room, touching things. In the kitchen, I opened cupboards and found them organized exactly as they'd always been. Spices alphabetized, mixing bowls nested by size, cookie cutters sorted into a vintage tin. In the bathroom, Grandma's reading glasses still sat beside the sink. Her favorite hand cream, barely used, stood on the counter. In her bedroom, the bed was neatly made with the quilt she'd stitched herself, a pattern of interlocking rings in shades of blue and green. I opened her closet. Her clothes hung in perfect order, organized by color and season. I recognized so many of these pieces: the green cardigan she always wore when working in the garden, the floral dress she'd worn to my college graduation, the navy blazer she reserved for church and special occasions. They smelled like her, like lavender sachets and ivory soap and something else I couldn't quite name, but that meant safety, meant home. I pulled the green cardigan off its hanger and put it on. It was too big, drowning my frame, but it felt like a hug. I sat down on the edge of her bed and let myself cry properly for the first time since she died. Not the polite tears at the funeral or the angry tears when Patricia was cataloging furniture. Real, ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that left me gasping for breath. When I finally stopped, exhausted and hollow, it was well past midnight. I couldn't face sleeping in Grandma's bed, so I made my way to the guest room, the one I'd always stayed in as a child. The twin bed with its chenille bedspread, the bookshelf full of young adult novels from various decades, the window that looked out over the side garden where Grandma had planted hostas and ferns that thrived in the shade. I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle, thinking about everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, I'd been standing in this house for Grandma's funeral, watching Patricia measure furniture. Now the house was mine. The garden was mine. The responsibility was mine. And I had absolutely no idea what to do with any of it. The next morning, I woke early, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling, the quality of light, the sounds of birds I didn't recognize. Then I remembered. Grandma was gone. The house was mine. My life had fundamentally changed. I got up and put on the green cardigan over my pajamas. In the kitchen, I made coffee using Grandma's ancient percolator, the one she'd refused to replace despite my offers to buy her a modern coffee maker. The coffee came out strong and slightly bitter, exactly how she'd always made it. I took my mug out to the back porch and sat in Grandma's rocking chair, the one with the faded cushion and the slightly uneven runners. The garden stretched before me in the morning light, dew still clinging to the rose petals, a rabbit nibbling clover at the far edge of the lawn. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Work emails, already piling up even though it was Saturday. My boss again, this time with a passive-aggressive subject line about team players and commitment. A message from my apartment building in Chicago about next month's rent. A text from Lisa asking how I was holding up. I stared at the phone for a long time. Then I did something radical. I turned off all my work notifications. Not just silenced them, actually disabled them. The little badge icons disappeared from my email app, from Slack, from every work-related program. If they needed me that badly, they could call. But I wasn't going to let Chicago invade every moment of my grief, my confusion, my attempts to figure out what came next. Over the next few days, I fell into a strange routine. I woke early, made coffee, sat in the garden. I answered only the most urgent work emails, delegating what I could, postponing what I couldn't. I spent hours going through Grandma's things, not to catalog or distribute them, but to understand them. I found a box of letters in the attic, correspondence between Grandma and Grandpa during the 2 years he'd spent overseas in the military. They were beautiful, tender, full of longing and hope and plans for their future. Reading them felt like an intrusion, but also like a gift. I'd never known my grandparents as young people in love. I'd only known them as the older couple, comfortable in their routines, finishing each other's sentences. In another box, I found photographs from before I was born. Grandma as a young woman with victory rolls in her hair, wearing a polka dot dress and saddle shoes. Grandpa in his uniform, impossibly young and handsome. My mother as a baby, then a toddler, then a gap-toothed kid. Patricia, too, softer looking than I'd ever seen her, smiling genuinely at the camera. There were photos of family gatherings, holiday dinners, birthday parties. In many of them, Grandma was in the background, often at the stove or setting the table or pouring drinks, always taking care of everyone else. When was the last time someone had taken care of her? I found her high school yearbook. She'd been voted most artistic. There were sketches in the margins of her notebooks, surprisingly good drawings of flowers and faces and landscapes. Why had I never known she could draw? Why had she never mentioned it? Then I found something that stopped me cold. A folder of rejection letters, all addressed to Eleanor Morrison, her maiden name. Art schools, gallery submissions, contest entries, dozens of them, spanning several years in her late teens and early 20s. All polite variations of no thank you, not quite what we're looking for, we regret to inform you. Underneath the rejection letters was a bundle of old sketches and a few small paintings. They were good, really good. Landscapes mostly, rendered in watercolors with a delicate touch. One showed a farmhouse I didn't recognize, surrounded by fields of wheat. Another depicted a city street corner with incredible attention to detail. A third was a portrait of a young man who I realized after a moment was my grandfather. Grandma had been an artist, a real artist, talented and passionate and persistent, and she'd given it up, or had it beaten out of her by rejection after rejection, by the practical realities of needing to earn money and raise children and keep a household running. No wonder she'd been so upset when I stopped painting. No wonder she'd called it my soul. She knew exactly what it felt like to let that part of yourself die. I sat on the attic floor, surrounded by her abandoned dreams, and cried again. But this time, mixed with the sadness, was something else. A fierce determination. She hadn't been able to pursue her art, but she was making damn sure I could pursue mine. That's what the house meant. That's what the inheritance meant. She was giving me the freedom she'd never had. I took the paintings and sketches downstairs and spread them out on the dining room table. I studied them, learning from her technique, seeing the world through her eyes. Then I did something I'd been avoiding since the funeral. I called my boss. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Rebecca, thank God. We need you back. The Henderson pitch is falling apart without you." I took a deep breath. I said, "I'm not coming back." There was a long pause. He said, "What do you mean you're not coming back? You're upset. You're grieving. Take another week. Take 2 weeks. But we need you." I said, "No. You need someone to work 80-hour weeks and sacrifice their entire life for marginal quarterly gains. That doesn't have to be me." I quit. He sputtered. He said, "You can't just quit. You have responsibilities. You have clients. You signed a contract." I said, "Check my contract. I have a 30-day notice requirement. I'm giving you notice. I'll transition my accounts remotely, but I'm done. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I can't do this anymore." He tried to argue. He offered me a raise. He offered me more vacation time. He offered me a promotion. Each offer just confirmed what I'd already known. They valued me for what I could produce, not for who I was. And I was done being valued that way. After I hung up, my hands were shaking. I'd just quit my job. My stable, well-paying, resume-building job. I'd just thrown away 6 years of career development on a whim. Except it wasn't a whim. It was the first truly honest decision I'd made in years. I called my parents next. I needed to tell them before I lost my nerve. Dad answered. He said, "Hey, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" I said, I just quit my job. There was a pause. Then he said, hold on. Your mother needs to hear this. I heard shuffling, then Mom's voice. She said, Rebecca, what's this about quitting your job? I explained everything. The emails, the pressure, the realization that I couldn't go back to that life, the paintings I'd found in the attic, the understanding of what Grandma had been trying to give me. When I finished, I braced myself for their response. Concern about my financial stability, worry about my career prospects, maybe even anger that I was throwing away the opportunities they'd worked so hard to help me achieve. Instead, Mom said quietly, good. I said, good? She said, good. That job was killing you, Rebecca. We could see it every time you came home. You were exhausted and anxious and not yourself. We were worried about you. We just didn't know how to say it without sounding like we didn't support your choices. Dad said, your grandmother saw it too. She told us months ago that you needed a way out. We thought she was being dramatic, but she wasn't. She was right, like always. We talked for another hour. They promised to come visit the following weekend to help me start going through Grandma's things properly, to support whatever decisions I made about the house and my future. After we hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years, like I'd been carrying a backpack full of rocks and finally set it down. But along with the lightness came fear. What was I going to do now? I had some savings, enough to live on for maybe 6 months if I was careful. The house was paid off, which eliminated the biggest expense, but I'd still need income eventually. And more than that, I needed purpose. I needed something to work toward. I thought about Grandma's paintings in the attic, about her artistic dreams that had been set aside, about the way she'd looked at me 6 months ago when she asked about my painting. What if I actually tried? What if I gave myself permission to be an artist, not just someone who painted occasionally, but someone who took it seriously? The idea was terrifying. It was impractical and risky and maybe even foolish, which is how I knew it was exactly what I needed to do. That afternoon, I cleaned out the sunroom. It had been Grandma's quilting space, full of fabric and thread and her sewing machine. I carefully packed everything away, storing it in the spare bedroom closet. Then I scrubbed the room clean, washed the windows until they sparkled, swept and mopped the floors. The room had incredible light, big windows facing north and west, perfect for painting. I measured the space, calculating how much I could fit. An easel, definitely. A work table for supplies, storage for canvases, maybe a comfortable chair for when I needed to step back and look at something from a distance. I drove to the hardware store in town, a place Grandma had frequented for gardening supplies and home repair items. The owner, an older man named Harold, recognized me. He said, Rebecca Chen, I heard about your grandmother. I'm so sorry. Eleanor was a wonderful woman. I thanked him. Then I said, I need paint. Wall paint. For the sunroom. He showed me samples. I chose a warm white, something that would reflect light without being too stark. He mixed it for me while I gathered brushes and rollers and drop cloths. As he rang up my purchase, he said, your grandmother used to talk about you, you know. Always proud, always worried. She said you were working too hard at something that didn't make you happy. I felt my throat tighten. I said, she was right about that. He nodded. He said, she was usually right about things. Drove people crazy sometimes, how often she was right. I spent the next 3 days painting the sunroom. I'd never painted a room before, not really. I'd helped with a few accent walls in college, but nothing like this. I learned as I went, making mistakes, getting paint in my hair and on my clothes. But there was something satisfying about the physical work, about transforming the space brush stroke by brush stroke. While the paint dried, I drove to the city, to a proper art supply store. I'd researched online, read reviews, made a list of what I needed. Good quality brushes, a range of oil paints, canvas in various sizes, turpentine and linseed oil, a palette, a new easel, sturdier than the cheap one I'd had in college. The store was overwhelming, full of options and possibilities. A young employee helped me, asking questions about my style and technique. I had to admit I didn't really have either yet. I was starting over, essentially beginning from scratch. She said, that's actually exciting. You're not trying to replicate what you used to do. You get to discover what you want to do now. I liked that perspective. Discovery, not recovery. I spent more than I should have, but every purchase felt like an investment in the person I was trying to become, the person Grandma believed I could be. I walked through the house after they left, touching things. The banister I'd slid down as a kid, the kitchen table where Grandma had taught me to roll out pie dough, the window seat in the bedroom where I used to curl up with books on rainy afternoons, the sunroom, the one with the big windows and the northern light where Grandma used to do her quilting. where she'd set up an easel for me one summer when I was 14 and told me to paint whatever I saw. I remembered that summer so vividly. I'd been angry about something, probably some teenage drama that felt world-ending at the time. Grandma had handed me a brush and said, "When words aren't enough, paint." I'd painted the garden, messy and experimental and completely imperfect. But it had felt good. It had felt like breathing after holding my breath underwater. When had I stopped? When had I decided that painting was frivolous, that art was impractical, that the only things worth doing were the things that paid well and looked good on a resume? I sat down on the window seat and pulled out my phone. My email inbox showed 43 unread messages, work emails, client requests, meeting invitations, all demanding my attention, my time, my energy. I thought about my studio apartment in Chicago. I thought about my commute on the L train, packed in with hundreds of other exhausted people. I thought about my desk at the marketing firm, in a cubicle with fluorescent lighting and no windows. I thought about the last time I'd felt truly happy there. I couldn't remember. That was the problem. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt happy. My boss's name appeared at the top of my email list. Subject line, "Urgent, need you back ASAP." I opened it. He wrote, "Rebecca, sorry for your loss, but we really need you on the Henderson pitch. Can you be back in the office Monday?" It was Friday night. Grandma's funeral had been this morning, and he wanted me back in 2 days. I stared at the email for a long time. Then I hit reply. I typed, "I need to take some time. I'll let you know when I'm coming back." My finger hovered over the send button. This was stupid. This was career suicide. You didn't just take undefined time off in the middle of a major pitch. You didn't put your personal life ahead of your professional obligations. But I thought about Grandma's letter. Permission to stop. Permission to breathe. I hit send. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I went up to the attic, to the old cedar chest where Grandma kept extra blankets and holiday decorations. I remembered putting something there, a long time ago. Under the quilts and the Christmas ornaments, I found it, my old art supplies, a tackle box full of paint tubes and brushes, a sketchbook with drawings from when I was 17, 18, 19, before college, before the practical degree my parents encouraged me to get, before I decided that being an artist was too risky, too impractical, too likely to disappoint everyone. I brought the box down to the sunroom and set it on the table. The paints were probably dried up. The brushes probably needed replacing, but just holding them felt like coming home. I didn't paint that night. I wasn't ready, but I sat in the sunroom until long after dark, just being there, just remembering. The next few weeks were chaos. There was so much to do, paperwork to file, accounts to transfer, utilities to switch into my name. My apartment lease in Chicago didn't end for another 6 months, but I called the landlord and worked out an early termination. It cost me 2 months' rent as a penalty, but I didn't care. Patricia called exactly once. She said, "I hope you know what you're doing, Rebecca. That house is a money pit. The roof needs work. The plumbing is ancient. You'll be drowning in maintenance costs within a year." I said, "Then it's a good thing it's my problem and not yours." She hung up. We haven't spoken since. Mom and Dad helped me move my things from Chicago. It wasn't much. A bed, a dresser, a few boxes of clothes and books. Everything else I either sold or donated. My co-workers threw me a half-hearted going-away happy hour. My boss told me I was making a huge mistake. My one close friend from the office, Lisa, said, "I get it. I really do. But God, I'm jealous." I said, "You could do it too. You could leave." She shook her head. She said, "I have student loans. I have rent. I have responsibilities." I didn't tell her that I had those things too, that I'd just decided they mattered less than the slowly dying feeling of staying where I was. The house felt enormous with just me in it. I spent the first few nights jumping at every creak and groan. Old houses make noise. They settle. They shift. They have personalities. I started small. I cleaned out the refrigerator, throwing away the leftovers from the funeral reception that nobody had remembered to take home. I washed all the dishes. I stripped the beds and did laundry. Basic tasks. Manageable tasks. Then I started going through Grandma's things, not to sell them or give them away, but to understand them. Every object had a story. The chipped teapot from her honeymoon in Ireland, the paperweight her father had brought back from the war, the needlepoint pillows she'd made during the winter after Grandpa died, when she needed something to do with her hands. I found journals tucked away in her bedside drawer, decades of them, thin notebooks with her spidery handwriting filling every page. I shouldn't have read them. They were private, but I couldn't help myself. Eleanor had written, "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices. If I should have been braver when I was young. If I should have taken more risks. But then I look at my garden, at the life I've built, at my daughters and grandchildren, and I know that maybe my choices weren't wrong, just different than I imagined. The tragedy isn't in choosing one path over another. It's in never choosing at all. It's in letting fear make all your decisions. Further down the page, she wrote, Rebecca reminds me of myself at her age, angry at the world for not being what she expected, angry at herself for not being who she hoped. I want to tell her that it's okay, that she has time, that she can start over as many times as she needs to. But you can't tell young people these things. They have to learn them the hard way. I closed the journal and cried. Great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. I cried for Grandma. I cried for all the conversations we'd never have. I cried for myself, for the years I'd spent sleepwalking through a life I didn't want. But eventually, the crying stopped. And then came something else. Something harder to name. A sort of quiet determination. I started painting again on a Tuesday morning in late September. The light in the sunroom was perfect, golden and soft. I'd gone to the art supply store in town the day before and bought new paints, new brushes, a fresh canvas. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine brought back memories so vivid they made my chest ache. I didn't know what to paint, so I started with colors. Just colors. Red bleeding into orange, blue mixing with yellow, purple shadows and bright highlights. No plan, no agenda, just the feeling of a brush in my hand and paint responding to my touch. It was terrible. Objectively, technically terrible. But it felt like breathing after being underwater for years. I painted every day after that. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for just 20 minutes before frustration or self-doubt took over. I painted the garden, over and over in different lights and seasons. I painted the house, the street, the trees. I painted from memory, scenes from childhood, places I'd been, people I'd loved. The first week, every painting ended up in the trash. I'd work for hours, step back, see nothing but failure, and destroy it. My inner critic, dormant for years, roared back to life with a vengeance. Each brushstroke felt wrong. Each color choice seemed amateurish. I kept comparing myself to real artists, to the paintings I'd seen in museums and galleries, and finding myself utterly inadequate. On the 8th day, I sat in the sunroom surrounded by destroyed canvases and wept. What had I been thinking? That I could just quit my job and become an artist? That talent and passion were enough? I was 28 years old, starting over from nothing, with no training, no connections, no real understanding of what I was doing. I almost called my old boss, almost begged for my job back, almost admitted that Grandma had been wrong about me, that I wasn't meant for this, that I should stick to what I was good at. Then I remembered something. A conversation from years ago, when I was in high school and had gotten a rejection letter from a summer art program I'd applied to. I'd been devastated, convinced it meant I had no talent. Grandma had found me crying in the garden. Eleanor had said, Rebecca, let me tell you something about rejection. It doesn't mean you're not good enough. It just means that particular door wasn't meant for you. The world is full of doors, sweetheart. Some of them will open easily. Some of them you'll have to knock on 100 times. And some of them you'll have to build yourself. She'd continued, I got rejected from every art school I applied to. Every single one. And you know what? Maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe my work wasn't what they were looking for. But that didn't mean I should have stopped creating. I let those rejections silence me, and I've regretted it every day since. She'd taken my hand. She'd said, Don't let anyone silence you, Rebecca. Not rejection letters, not critics, not even yourself. Create because you need to, not because someone told you you're allowed to. Sitting in my new studio, I finally understood what she'd meant. I wasn't painting to prove anything to anyone. I wasn't painting to build a career or gain recognition or make money. I was painting because something inside me needed to express itself, and painting was the language it spoke. I stopped destroying my work. Instead, I started keeping everything, even the failures. I lined them up along the walls of the sunroom and studied them. What worked? What didn't? What made me feel something, even if the execution was flawed? I started a practice routine like an athlete training. Every morning I did sketches. Quick studies, 5 minutes each. The coffee cup on the table, the view out the window, my own hand. I wasn't trying to create masterpieces. I was retraining my eye, my hand, the connection between what I saw and what I could reproduce. In the afternoons, I worked on longer pieces. I gave myself permission to experiment, to fail, to make ugly things. I mixed colors I'd never tried before. I used palette knives instead of brushes. I painted on surfaces other than canvas, trying cardboard, wood panels, even old bed sheets stretched over frames. I also started studying. I checked out books from the library about color theory, composition, the history of landscape painting. I watched free tutorials on YouTube, pausing and rewinding, trying to understand techniques. I visited local galleries, looking at other artists' work not with envy but with curiosity. How did they solve this problem? What choices did they make? Mrs. Harrison from the garden club became an unexpected mentor. She stopped by one afternoon with cuttings from her own roses to plant in Grandma's garden. When she saw my paintings in the sunroom, she stood quietly for a long time, just looking. Finally, she said, "These are honest." I said, "They're not very good yet." She waved her hand dismissively. She said, "Good is subjective. Honest is rare. You're not trying to paint what you think people want to see. You're painting what you actually see. That's valuable." She started coming by every week, always with some excuse, bringing vegetables from her garden, asking for help identifying a plant, borrowing a book, but she always ended up in the sunroom, looking at whatever I'd been working on, offering observations that were never quite criticism but always helpful. She'd say things like, "The light in this corner feels different than the rest of the painting. Is that intentional?" Or, "I notice you use a lot of cool colors. Have you experimented with warmer palettes?" Or, "This reminds me of a painting I saw once. Let me find the book and show you." She never told me what to do. She just asked questions that made me think, made me look at my own work with fresh eyes. Through her, I met other members of the local art community, a watercolor painter named Julia, who taught classes at the community center, a sculptor named Michael who worked with reclaimed wood, a fiber artist named Carmen who created intricate tapestries. They were all older than me, established in their practices, generous with their knowledge. They invited me to join their monthly critique group. I almost said no, terrified of showing my amateur work to real artists, but I thought about Grandma's letter, permission to be brave. The first critique session was excruciating. I brought 3 paintings, set them up, and wanted to die as 5 experienced artists studied them in silence. Finally, Julia spoke. She said, "Tell us about your process. What were you trying to achieve with these?" I explained, stumbling over my words, about trying to capture the garden at different times of day, about working with light and shadow, about feeling hopelessly outmatched by the subject. Michael nodded. He said, "We've all been there. That moment when you realize the gap between your vision and your current skill level. It's painful, but it's also where growth happens." They gave me feedback. Honest, constructive, sometimes hard to hear. My composition was too centered. My color mixing was muddy in places. My brushwork lacked confidence. But they also pointed out things that worked. The way I'd captured a particular quality of morning light, an interesting color combination in one corner, the emotional resonance of a certain piece, even if the technique was flawed. I left that first session feeling like I'd been run over by a truck, but I also felt energized. These people took my work seriously enough to critique it honestly. They saw potential worth developing. I worked harder after that. I painted with more intention, thinking about the feedback I'd received. I experimented with composition, trying the rule of thirds, playing with asymmetry. I practiced color mixing, creating charts of different combinations. I worked on my brushwork, trying to be more decisive, more confident in my marks. But I also struggled. There were days when nothing came together, when every painting felt like a disaster, when I questioned everything. Days when I scrolled through social media and saw artists my age or younger creating work that made mine look like kindergarten finger painting. Days when I calculated how much money I'd spent on supplies versus how many paintings I'd completed and felt sick to my stomach. On particularly bad days, I'd walk in the garden. I'd pull weeds, deadhead roses, talk to the plants like Grandma used to do. The garden didn't judge. It didn't compare itself to other gardens. It just grew, patiently, persistently, one day at a time. One afternoon in late October, while I was working in the garden, a car pulled up. A woman I didn't recognize got out, looking around with obvious interest. She was maybe in her mid-30s, wearing jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She said, "Hi, I'm looking for Rebecca Chen." I stood up, wiping dirt on my jeans. I said, "That's me." She smiled. She said, "I'm Amanda Rodriguez. I run a small gallery in town. Julia from your critique group showed me some photos of your work. I was hoping I could see more." My heart started pounding. A gallery owner. Here, looking at my work. This felt too fast, too soon. I'd only been painting seriously for 2 months. I wasn't ready. But I heard Grandma's voice in my head. Don't let fear make all your decisions. I said, sure, come on in. I led her to the sunroom, suddenly hyper-aware of every flaw in every painting. The muddy colors, the awkward compositions, the amateur brushwork. I wanted to explain, to make excuses, to tell her I was just starting out, that these weren't really representative of what I could do. But I kept my mouth shut and let her look. Amanda moved slowly through the room, stopping at each painting, sometimes stepping close, sometimes stepping back. She didn't say anything for what felt like hours, but was probably 5 minutes. Finally, she turned to me. She said, "How long have you been painting?" I said honestly, 2 months. I painted in high school and college, but then I stopped for 6 years. I just started again recently. She nodded slowly. She said, "That explains some of the technical struggles I'm seeing, but it doesn't explain the emotional authenticity. Most new painters, or painters getting back into it, they're trying so hard to prove something, trying to make impressive work. But these pieces, they're not trying to impress anyone. They're just trying to be honest." I didn't know what to say to that. Mom came to visit every week. She'd bring groceries and casseroles and spend the afternoon helping me work on the house. The roof did need work, just like Patricia had said. The plumbing made concerning noises. But Dad helped me find good contractors, people who'd known Grandma and gave me fair prices. Mom said one afternoon while we were painting the kitchen, "You seem different." I paused, my roller dripping pale yellow. I said, "Different how?" She smiled. She said, "Lighter. Like you've put down something heavy you'd been carrying." I hadn't told her about my painting. I wasn't ready to show anyone yet. But she was right. I did feel lighter. In October, Marcus called me. This was surprising because Marcus and I had never been particularly close. He was Patricia's son, raised with her values, her priorities. But his voice on the phone sounded uncertain, almost shy. He said, "Hey, Rebecca, I hope I'm not bothering you." I said, "No, it's fine. What's up?" There was a long pause. Then he said, "I wanted to apologize for the funeral, for what Mom did. It was messed up." I sat down on the porch steps. I said, "Thank you. That means a lot." He said, "I've been thinking about what Grandma wrote in that letter, about the money being to help us start but not define us. And I realized I've been letting Mom define me my whole life, doing what she wants, studying what she thinks is practical, working at her friend's firm because she arranged it. And I hate it. I hate all of it." I asked, "What do you want to do?" He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. He said, "I want to be a teacher, elementary school. I know it doesn't pay great, and Mom would kill me if she knew, but that's what I want. I love kids. I love the idea of helping them learn, watching them figure things out. Is that crazy?" I said, "No, it's not crazy at all. It's actually really beautiful." He said, "I'm using the money Grandma left me to go back to school, get my teaching certification. Mom doesn't know yet. I'm kind of terrified to tell her." I said, "She's going to be angry. You know that, right?" He said, "Yeah. But I think Grandma knew that when she left me the money. I think she was giving me a way out." After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching the sun set over the garden. Grandma had known exactly what she was doing. She'd given each of us what we needed, not what we wanted. She'd given me a house and a chance to start over. She'd given Marcus the means to escape. She'd given Mom security. And she'd given Patricia exactly what Patricia had given her, a transactional relationship with no emotional weight. In November, the garden started preparing for winter. I learned how to cut back the perennials, how to mulch the beds, how to protect the roses. Mrs. Harrison, one of Grandma's friends from the garden club, came over one afternoon to help. She was in her 70s, with dirt permanently under her fingernails, and an encyclopedic knowledge of every plant in the county. She said, as we worked, "Eleanor talked about you all the time, you know." I said, "She did?" Mrs. Harrison nodded. She said, "She was so proud of you, but she was worried too. She said you'd forgotten how to be yourself, that you were so busy being what everyone else needed that you'd lost track of what you needed." I pulled at a stubborn weed. I said she was right. Mrs. Harrison said, "She usually was. Annoyingly so sometimes." She looked at me critically. She said, "You're painting again." I blinked. I said, "How did you know?" She pointed at my hands, paint under my nails, blue and green. I said, "I've been experimenting." She smiled. She said, "Good. Eleanor would be pleased. She always said the world has enough accountants and lawyers and marketing directors. It needs more people brave enough to make beautiful things." That night, I looked at the canvases I'd been working on, really looked at them. They weren't masterpieces, they weren't gallery-worthy, but they were mine. They were honest. They were real. I took a photo of one, a painting of Grandma's garden in summer, all wild roses and sunshine. I posted it on Instagram, something I hadn't done in months. I didn't write a caption, just the image. Within an hour, I had dozens of comments. Friends I hadn't heard from in years, acquaintances from college. Even Lisa, my old coworker, who wrote, "Holy shit, Beck. I didn't know you could paint like that. Do you have more?" I did have more. 20 canvases worth of more, stacked against the walls of the sunroom, chronicling my slow reawakening. In December, I got a message from someone I didn't know. Her name was Amanda Rodriguez, and she ran a small gallery in town. She wrote, "I hope this isn't too forward, but a friend sent me your painting. I'd love to see more of your work. Would you be interested in meeting?" My first instinct was to say no, to tell her I wasn't a real artist, that these were just hobby pieces, nothing serious. But I thought about Grandma's letter. Permission to be brave. I wrote back, yes, I'd like that. We met at a coffee shop the following week. Amanda was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with paint-stained jeans and bright red glasses. She had a laptop covered in stickers and an energy that made me feel immediately at ease. She said, "Show me what you've got." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos of my paintings. She looked at each one carefully, asking questions. What inspired this one? What were you feeling here? Why these colors? Finally, she sat back. She said, "These are good. Raw, but good. You have a voice. It's not fully developed yet, but it's there." I said, "I'm not a trained artist. I mean, I took some classes in high school and college, but I got a degree in marketing. I've been working in corporate America for 6 years. She shrugged. She said, "So? Some of the best artists I know came to it late. They have life experience that enriches their work. Your paintings have something that can't be taught. They have feeling." She proposed a show, a small one, in her gallery's back room, in March. Just my work. I'd need at least 15 finished pieces, properly framed and priced. She'd handle the logistics, take a commission on any sales, and help with promotion. I walked home in a daze. A show, an actual art show, 3 months away. I called Mom. I said, "I need to tell you something." And then I told her everything, about the painting, about Amanda, about the show. Mom was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, that's wonderful. But are you sure you're ready for this?" I said, "No, I'm terrified, but I'm doing it anyway." She laughed. She said, "That's my girl. That's the Rebecca I remember." The next 3 months were the hardest and most fulfilling of my life. I painted every day, pushing myself to improve, to experiment, to take risks. I attended a weekly life drawing class at the community center. I watched YouTube tutorials on color theory and composition. I read books about art history and technique. I also worked on the house, patched the roof, fixed the plumbing, refinished the hardwood floors. Every improvement felt like an investment not just in the property, but in myself, in the idea that I was staying, that this was home now. Patricia showed up unannounced one Saturday in February. I was in the garden, pruning the roses, when her car pulled into the driveway. My stomach clenched. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. She got out of the car slowly, looking around. She said, "Place looks good." I said, "Thanks. What do you want, Patricia?" She didn't answer right away. She walked around the garden, touching plants, her face unreadable. Finally, she said, "I was angry, at the funeral. I said things I shouldn't have." I waited. She continued, "I'm not apologizing. I still think Mother's decision was unfair, but I've had time to think about it, and I realized that I was angry at the wrong person. I was angry at you, but I should have been angry at myself." I set down my pruning shears. I said, "What do you mean?" Patricia sat down on the porch steps, looking older than I'd ever seen her. She said, "I took care of Mother because I thought it would earn me something. I thought if I was useful enough, present enough, practical enough, she'd see that I was the responsible one, the one who deserved to inherit. But she saw right through me. She saw that I was keeping score, that every favor came with an expectation of return. And that hurt. It hurt to realize she knew what I was doing, maybe better than I knew myself. I didn't know what to say. This was the most honest Patricia had ever been with me. She said, "You weren't keeping score. You were just living your life, making your mistakes. And somehow that's what she valued. The authenticity. Even when you were screwing up, you were genuine." I said quietly, "I don't think Grandma saw it as you versus me. I think she gave us each what we needed. She gave you what you can measure and quantify, things with clear value. She gave me something messier, a chance, a challenge." Patricia stood up. She said, "Maybe. Or maybe she was trying to teach us both something. You needed to learn to slow down, to value things beyond productivity. And I needed to learn that not everything worth having can be earned through strategy and effort. She started walking back to her car. Then she turned. She said, "Good luck with whatever you're doing here, Rebecca." I mean that. After she drove away, I sat on the steps for a long time, thinking about forgiveness and family, and the complicated ways people try to love each other. The show opened on the first Friday in March. Amanda's gallery was small but well lit, with white walls and polished concrete floors. My paintings lined the space, 15 of them, ranging from small studies to large canvases. I'd titled the show Grandmother's Garden, and Amanda had printed up a simple statement about inheriting more than property, about finding your way home. I was terrified. What if nobody came? What if they hated everything? What if this was all a huge mistake? But people did come. Mom and Dad, of course. Marcus drove down with his new girlfriend, a fellow teaching student. Mrs. Harrison and half the garden club, old friends from high school. Even Lisa, who'd driven 3 hours from Chicago. And strangers. People I'd never met, who'd seen the promotional posts, who were curious. They walked around the gallery, studying my paintings, reading the little cards with titles and prices. Amanda found me hiding in the corner, clutching a plastic cup of wine. She said, "3 paintings have sold already, and the night's just starting." I stared at her. I said, "3?" She grinned. She said, "I told you, you have something real. People can feel it." By the end of the night, 7 paintings had sold. 7. People gave me their money in exchange for things I'd made with my hands and my heart. It felt surreal. An older woman approached me near the end of the evening. She said, "I knew Eleanor. She was in my quilting circle." I said, "Oh, she was wonderful, wasn't she?" The woman nodded. She said, "She showed us photos of the house, of the garden. She talked about you all the time, worried about you. But at the end, she wasn't worried anymore. She said she'd figured out how to help you." She looked around at the paintings. She said, "I think it worked." After everyone left, Amanda and I sat in the empty gallery, surrounded by my work. She said, "So, what's next?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "This is just the beginning. You have talent. You have a voice. You need to decide what you want to do with it. Keep it small and local. Try to grow. Apply to residencies. Pursue representation. The art world is tough, but you've got something." I thought about it. 6 months ago, I would have immediately started planning, strategizing, optimizing, treating it like a career to be conquered. But I'd learned something in the months since Grandma died. I'd learned that not everything needs to be optimized, that sometimes the value is in the doing, not just the achieving. I said, "I want to keep painting. I want to get better. I want to have more shows, but I don't want to lose what makes it meaningful. I don't want it to become another way to prove my worth." Amanda nodded. She said, "That's wise. A lot of artists burn out because they forget why they started. They get caught up in the business and lose the joy." We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Amanda said, "Eleanor must have been an amazing woman." I smiled. I said, "She really was." Spring came to Grandma's garden in a riot of color. The roses she'd planted bloomed pink and red and yellow. The perennials she'd tended for decades pushed up through the soil. The cardinals built their nest in the oak tree, just like they did every year. I painted it all. The garden became my primary subject, my endless inspiration. Each painting was different, capturing a different moment, a different light, a different feeling. Marcus got his teaching certification. He took a job at an elementary school in a different state, far enough from Patricia that he could build his own life. He called me every few weeks, excited and exhausted and happier than I'd ever heard him. Mom used some of her inheritance money to take Dad on a trip to Ireland, something they'd talked about for years but never done. They sent me photos from Galway and Dublin, both of them grinning in front of ancient castles and green hills. And me? I kept painting. I taught art classes at the community center on Tuesday evenings. I volunteered at the local school, helping kids explore their creativity. I tended Grandma's garden, learning the rhythms of the seasons, the patience required to help things grow. Amanda offered me another show for the fall. I said yes. I dated a little, nothing serious. A guy named Thomas who ran the bookstore downtown. We went to dinner, took walks, talked about our favorite novels. It didn't turn into anything intense, and that was okay. I was still figuring out who I was. I didn't need to figure out who we were yet. One afternoon in May, I was working in the garden when I heard a car pull up. I looked up to see Diane, Patricia's daughter, getting out. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. She walked over slowly, like she wasn't sure she was welcome. She said, "Hey." I said, "Hey, what brings you here?" She looked around at the garden, at the house, at the easel I'd set up on the lawn. She said, "I wanted to see what you've done with the place. Mom's been talking about it. She sounds almost impressed, which is weird." I laughed. I said, "Want a tour?" We walked through the garden, and I pointed out the different plants, told her their names and where Grandma had gotten them. We went inside, and I showed her the improvements I'd made, the way I'd kept Grandma's aesthetic while making the space my own. In the sunroom, Diane stopped in front of my current work in progress, a large canvas of the oak tree with the cardinal nest. She said, "You painted this?" I nodded. She said quietly, "It's really beautiful. I didn't know you were an artist." I said, "I'm not sure I knew either. Not really. Not until I had the space to figure it out." She turned to me. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Do you think Grandma knew that leaving you the house would change your whole life like this?" I thought about it. About Grandma's sharp eyes and sharper mind. About her letter, her carefully chosen words. About the way she'd seen me better than I'd seen myself. I said, "Yeah, I think she knew exactly what she was doing." Diane nodded slowly. She said, "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About how she gave everyone what they needed, not what they wanted. Marcus got his escape route. You got your second chance. My mom got forced to reckon with why she does what she does. And me and Marcus, we got just enough money to have options without having them made for us." I said, "What options are you thinking about?" She smiled. A real smile, not the distant one I was used to seeing. She said, "I'm applying to graduate school. Environmental science. I want to work on conservation, maybe focus on urban ecosystems. Mom thinks it's impractical, but she's letting me make my own decisions for once. I think Grandma's will shook her more than she admits." We sat on the porch for a while, drinking lemonade, talking about life and choices and the complicated legacy of a woman who'd seen us all more clearly than we saw ourselves. After Diane left, I went back to my painting. But I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about Grandma, about the last time I'd seen her, about that conversation on this very porch. She'd asked me when I'd stopped painting, and I'd gotten defensive. I'd changed the subject. But now I understood that she wasn't judging me. She was worried. She was trying to figure out how to help. And she had. She'd helped in the most dramatic, complicated, perfect way possible. I pulled out my phone and found a photo of her, one Mom had sent me after we'd cleaned out Grandma's albums. She was in her garden, wearing her ancient straw hat and gardening gloves, smiling at the camera. Behind her, roses bloomed in profusion. I said out loud, "Thank you. I know you can't hear me, but thank you. For seeing me, for believing I could find my way back, for giving me permission to try." The wind rustled through the oak tree, and a cardinal sang from somewhere in the branches. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe, in some small way, she heard. That evening, I stood in the sunroom and looked at the canvases covering the walls. A year ago, I'd been in Chicago, drowning in a life that looked successful but felt hollow. Now I was here, in Grandma's house. My house, surrounded by paint and possibility. I picked up my brush and mixed a new color, something between gold and amber, the exact shade of late afternoon light on rose petals. I touched it to the canvas, and it felt like coming home. Not to a place, but to myself. To the person I'd been before I got lost, and to the person I was becoming now. Outside, the garden grew wild and beautiful. Inside, I painted it, trying to capture not just what it looked like, but what it meant. Home, growth, second chances. The patient work of tending things until they bloom. Grandma had known I needed this. She'd known I needed space and time and permission. She'd given me all three, wrapped up in property deeds and inheritance documents and one perfect letter. I painted until the light faded and my back ached and my mind felt quiet and clear. Then I cleaned my brushes, made dinner, and sat on the porch watching the fireflies emerge in the dusk. Tomorrow I'd paint again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because this wasn't just about art. It was about choosing every single day to build a life that felt true, to honor not just Grandma's memory, but the gift she'd given me, the gift of becoming myself. The house settled around me, creaking and groaning in its familiar way. Somewhere in the garden, the cardinals were settling into their nest for the night. The roses released their evening perfume into the cooling air. I thought about Patricia at the funeral, already measuring furniture, about how close I'd come to that same transactional approach to life, where everything had a price and every action was calculated. And I thought about where I was now, uncertain of the future, but certain of the present, making art that might never hang in major galleries, but that meant everything to me. Living in a house that needed constant maintenance, but that felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever been. Grandma had left me more than property. She'd left me a question. What will you do with this chance? I was still figuring out the answer, but for the first time in years, I was excited to find out. The summer stretched ahead, full of possibility. More paintings to make, more of the garden to tend, more of myself to discover. And beneath it all, Grandma's voice, quiet and sure, saying what she'd always said when I was afraid to try something new. Eleanor always said, the worst thing that can happen is you'll learn something. I was learning about color and light and composition, about patience and growth and the slow work of building something beautiful, about forgiveness and family and the ways people surprise you. But mostly, I was learning about myself, about what I needed, about what I valued, about who I wanted to be. And in learning that, I was honoring Grandma's legacy better than any amount of dutiful visiting or practical caretaking ever could have. I raised my glass of wine to the darkening sky. I said, here's to second chances. Here's to brave choices. Here's to you, Grandma. You stubborn, brilliant, impossible woman. You saved my life. The cardinal sang one last time before settling in for the night, and I sat on the porch of my grandmother's house, my house, feeling more alive than I had in years, ready for whatever came next.